Q, also known as Wheeljack, has been deemed one of the most underrated characters in Bayformers, for him being the sole purpose of the Autobots winning in Dark of the Moon, and if you don't believe me, watch this video in the hopes that I can change your perspective on this underrated character. Welcome back, Trans Theorists, to another episode of Fixing Transformers, and in today's video we're going to talk about the importance of Q. But before I do, I would like to give a quick shout out to my sponsor, McRad Anarchy. Now, McRad Anarchy is a Minecraft 1.14.3 Anarchy server, which allows players to use a hack client if they so choose. Now, for what I've heard, the server at the moment has not that many players whatsoever, and is looking for an active community of players to play on it. So I've taken it upon myself to fill that void, and I'm hoping some of you guys will join me on the crazy adventure McRad Anarchy has to offer. And now for our sponsor out of the way, let's take a deep dive in what Q has done for the Autobots in Dark of the Moon. So without further ado, let's jump right in. Sometime during the events between Transformers Revenge of the Fallen and Dark of the Moon, two Autobots crash landed on Earth. One who went by the name of Mirage, who would later nickname himself Dino, and the other Wheeljack, who would later nickname himself Q, as a nod to the James Bond inventor by the name of Q. And up until the events of Dark of the Moon, Q had been up to a lot of things since his arrival, from making better technology for the Nest soldiers to upgrading his Autobot comrades with the help of Ratchet. So let's kick it off with some upgrades Q did for the Autobots, and there are many I bet you guys didn't even think of. For example, did you ever question why all of the Autobot cast had some type of upgrade, from their new vehicle forms to upgrades in their robot modes? Well, let's start with the Autobot leader Optimus Prime himself, and by far he had the most work done to him. And with his physical appearance, there are two big features that already stand out. One, which is being his abdomen area, and second, his forearm guards. And it's not like Prime scanned a new truck to get these pieces, since his alt mode stayed the same throughout the original trilogy. So the question is, why upgrade these parts? Well, for his abdomen it was very simple, since it needed to be reinforced so fatal blows would have a harder time breaking through the armor. And this makes perfect sense, since if you remember in Revenge of the Fallen, his whole chest was blown out by Megatron. But on a side note, oddly enough, by the end of the film, his whole body would be fully regenerated, like there was no damage whatsoever. And I originally thought that his body got fixed due to Jetfire's parts, but that would surely not be the case, since the extra parts were shed off, and were left as a memorial to honor Jetfire. And only some of the parts did actually stay on Prime, fixing him slightly. For example, his spark chamber, I like to believe was fixed due to the parts, but we can definitely say that his parts did not fix his whole body, leaving the answer to be that he slowly regenerated his body between the time when he was resurrected till the aircraft carrier scene, which is proven by the fact that if you look at this shot, Optimus's windows are shattered, and he's also missing his review mirrors. But after the Fallen's death, Prime has his mirrors back and his windshield is unscathed. And now for his forearm guards. The reason why they were upgraded was to be used as another melee weapon. If you remember in the Forest fight, Optimus uses forearm guards here and there as an attack weapon, but if you look at the forearm guards, they are squared off, and could be used more efficiently if it had a jagged point, which is why Q added them so Prime could cut his opponents up. Another thing Q has done for Prime, and by far his main upgrade, would be his weapons. And boy did Prime have a lot of these in Dark of the Moon. First of all, his trailer, which if you want to find more info on this upgrade, click on the iCard above, since I already did its own video. But if you don't want to do that now, here's a quick recap on his trailer. Prime's trailer could transform into an armored weapons platform, being able to carry many weapons. And could also transform into a jetpack for Optimus that he used to battle the Driller, along with the Decepticon army, towards the end of the film. Alongside that, Q also created the Energon Axe for Prime, along with his knuckle dusters that he would use to kill Shockwave, his shield that he used to defend himself, and all the other weapons that were in the arsenal, but most notably his heavy assault rifle, which would later become his primary weapon in Transformers Age of Extinction. But the last thing Q did for Prime that would for the most part change how Autobots would use their weapons entirely up until the last night would be handheld weapons. Let me explain. With all the weapons that he gave Prime, besides the knuckle dusters and the forearm guards, were all handheld weapons. And up until Dark of the Moon, the Autobots primarily preferred having built-in weapons instead of using handheld ones, with the outliers being Sideswipe and Optimus, for both of them having handheld firearms. But if you look how many times they used those handheld weapons in the previous films, Optimus only used his to shoot Starscream and Megatron out the window, and also execute Demolisher. And besides that, they were absent for the rest of Revenge of the Fallen. For Sideswipe, he had his two guns in two scenes in the final battle of Revenge of the Fallen, but all this would end up flipping on its head, since in Dark of the Moon, Sideswipe would end up using his two new blasters much more instead of his trusty blades. And in Prime's case, Q made all of his Energon blades handheld, so he'd be able to use more fighting techniques with them. For example, he used it as a handheld sword while fighting Sentinel Prime, and during his rage he throws one of them at the mini brawl drone, slicing its torso in half. But the coolest thing with this new upgrade is that he can still use his energy on swords as normal if he so chooses. Now remember how I said that this upgrade would, for the most part, change how the Autobots would use their weapons? Well, if you guys remember, all the Autobots in Age of Extinction, besides Bumblebee, use handheld weapons. And B would jump onto this trend in The Last Night by recollecting his Warhammer, by using it against Prime. But now you may be wondering, why is this Q's fault? Well, the reason why he's the purpose for the Autobots using handheld weapons is because that he revolutionized the idea. And because Optimus used a handheld weapon to kill the Decepticon leader and Sentinel Prime, most Autobots saw this as a better alternative to their built-in weapons, and started to adapt. And that was all Q did for Optimus. But now let's take a look at what he did for Ironhide. And for Ironhide, Q would design 2 new weapons for him since he lost his beloved cannons during the Operation Firestorm airstrike. And these 2 new weapons would be deemed Heavy Iron and Heavy Iron 2.0, which he would use to interrogate Crankcase and Crowbar. And here's a fun movie mistake in this scene. When Ironhide drops his guns on the ground, they're on the ground, but in this shot when he gets hit, he has them back on his back. But when he kills Crowbar, they are missing from his back, until he picks them back off the ground after the fight. But the last thing I would like to say until we move on to Sideswipe is, you may be wondering why Ironhide wasn't able to regenerate his cannons, while in contrast, Optimus was able to regenerate his own body. Well, the reason for this is, since his cannons were implanted weapons, they would not regenerate. And the best way to explain this is like this. In humans, for example, if we get a cut on our skin, it will eventually regenerate itself. But let's say we have a crown, which is basically a screw that gets drilled into your gum, and they put a prosthetic tooth over the screw, so you can have your missing tooth back. But let's say that screw breaks. That sucker ain't gonna regenerate, causing you to be in a lot of pain and to go back to the dentist to get a replacement. So I hope this gives you some insight on why his whole body regenerated instead, but not the cannons. And I'm pretty sure Q could have possibly made new cannons for Ironhide, but due to the lack of time he had to make an alternative, which is proven by the fact that Ironhide is given Heavy Iron 2.0 at the beginning of Dark of the Moon. But now with Ironhide out of the way, let's move on to Sideswipe. And for him, a lot was done in terms of his vehicle mode. For example, to change from being a hardtop to being a convertible. And there's actually a very important reason why this change would be beneficial for Sideswipe, and that would be for him to be a lot lighter, in turn making him much faster. Let me explain. As we remember in Revenge of the Fallen, Sideswipe was a hardtop car, and that roof of his would definitely weigh him down slightly, so without it would make him a lot faster, along with his spoiler that he has at the back of his car. And it's not for show either, because a spoiler actually gives more downforce on a car, reducing drag, and will generally increase high-speed stability due to the reduced rear lift, which is basically fancy talk meaning the car will go faster. And the final thing Q did for Sideswipe was to give him 2 new upgraded blasters to replace the one that he had in Revenge of the Fallen. And these blasters would pack a lot of punch, since when Ironhide used it, it one-shot Crowbar, killing him. So I can say that this would definitely be a useful upgrade. And now moving away from Sideswipe, let's move on to everyone's favorite yellow Autobot, Canopy. Oh wait, he's dead. I mean Bumblebee. And now for the B-Man himself, he would receive a lot of upgrades. The main one being for him to scan a brand new Chevy Camaro to update the old one that he scanned back in 2007. But now you may be wondering, wait, didn't Bumblebee scan another Camaro in Revenge of the Fallen? Well, the answer to this is no, and here is why. When Revenge of the Fallen comes around in 2009, Bumblebee is still the same Camaro, but with a new front bumper and hood. And the best guess on how he got these new parts would be through Sam, since he most likely brought Bumblebee to a body shop to give him a slightly new look, while keeping the aesthetics of the old one.
This is the original Bumblebee from the first Transformers motion picture. We've got a lot more aggressive facial features. The hood has huge openings and slots for cooling. The entire car has been widened and slightly lowered for a more menacing and aggressive appearance.
But the upgrades Bumblebee would receive from Q would be tremendous, starting off with the spoiler to help with downforce, along with giving him a robot mode aesthetic change. For now, a spoiler would become the bottom wings instead of the back windows of his car. And since the bumper and trunk of his 2010 Camaro is different from his 2006, the backlight parts would change to show up just as the lights, since his new spoiler would have to be implemented into the new transformation, causing the pieces to go elsewhere into the legs. Another upgrade Q would give Bumblebee would be his hood vents, and bumper vents to give his engine better performance, and also his hood vents are seen here replacing the old neck guards. He would also get a front splitter to help with downforce, which we can see in Bumblebee's robot mode here. And help that splitter stay in place, Q would design Bumblebee a vest that would keep it snug, and his vest would also serve as some extra armor for being in combat. But the main upgrade Q gave to Bumblebee was to make him lighter, and here's how. All of the upgrades Q gave B except for the vest were all made out of carbon fiber, including the racing stripes that he gave B. Now the reason why this is important is because carbon fiber is a light material. In turn, making the car lighter will make it go faster. which would help B get out of sticky situations in vehicle mode, and a clear example of this was when he was saving Lennox and Sam from Starscream's corpse. And if you don't believe me about the whole lighter carbon fiber thing, even B's toes are now laced in carbon fiber, so it's not that far to say that some internal parts were also converted into carbon fiber too. And with the topic of weight reduction, B's arms also did get scaled down a bit, and my best guess for why is Q would do this just to give Bumblebee some better mobility in his arms, since his previous forearm guards were a bit bulky. And now moving away from B, we can finally move on to the Autobot trio, the Wreckers. And for them there was one big change that they got, and that would be for them to become weaponizers. But there's a gray area here, which is that they are engineers themselves, proven by the fact that once they completed their Autobot training in Diego Garcia, they were immediately sent to work on the Autobot ship Byzantium that brought the second wave of Autobots to Earth, and they also created much of their own weaponry. So the question is, how did they get the Q to become weaponizers if they were stuck at NASA the whole time? Well, there's actually one line in the film that suggests that they left the base before.
You guys are the Wreckers. They take care of the Xanthium. We don't let them off the base much because they're assholes.
As we heard, they were not let off the base much, and much is our key word here, proving that they have left the base before. And here's where we can connect the dots with Q. But before we get into that, I would like to clear up a misconception with the Wreckers. And that misconception would be people believing that they were always weaponizers. And though there's not that much evidence that conflicts with this claim, I did find evidence that can support my claim. The first of which would be the Dark of the Moon behind the scenes documentary.
The Wreckers are 3 new vehicles. The interesting thing is they're partially transformed and they're equipped with Gatling guns.
So for the movie rendition of them, we saw them as a pit crew, and thus the NASCAR disguises and the brash kind of rough and tumble attitude.
Alright, so let's break this down. In the first part we heard that they are partly transformed, with guns sticking out of them, which sounds very similar to Stealth Force, doesn't it? And it's also referenced in the next part when we see the yellow Wreckers alternate mode, which is a yellow Nash car barely with any amount of weaponry in the vehicle mode, compared to the Wreckers alternate modes which are guns galore. And like I said before, it looks a lot like Stealth Force. And if you look at the Wreckers themselves in robot mode, they honestly do not have that much weaponized parts besides their guns in robot mode. With Roadbuster, we can see that his robot form has many guns, some of which that appear in vehicle form. But here's where things get tricky. If you look at Road in his vehicle form, his Red 88 logo is surrounded by this armor. But when he's in robot form, this armor is gone, leaving a clean 88 logo. And this phenomenon also works with Topspin, because if you look at his 48, it's also surrounded by this armor. But in robot mode, the armor is nowhere to be seen. And this oddly enough also happens in his legs. Since if you look at his hood, it's all armored up. But in robot form, it's gone, never to be seen. And this is proven by the fact that we can see the W in Loaves, but when he's in vehicle form, it's covered up. And in Leadfoot's case, strangely enough, his 42 panel would merge with the top of his door in robot mode to make a perfect NASCAR door, even when there's no door in his vehicle mode. But why does this happen? Well, luckily the answer is very simple. And if you recall, it was actually said in the documentary.
The interesting thing is they're partially transformed and they're equipped with Gatling guns.
The Wreckers are partly transformed, which indirectly confirms that they use Stealth Force, but more or less a different type, since there are 2 types of Stealth Force, Base and Race, which I have deemed them for the time being. Base being the base form of Stealth Force, the one that Sideswipe and Bumblebee use, while Race would be exclusive for the Wreckers, in the fact that they would not have Mobility Drive, which Bumblebee and Sideswipe had, and Mobility Drive is where your car could move in a north, south, east, and west direction, without turning. And this concept was most seen in the somewhat canon Dark of the Moon game, where when you transform and activate your Stealth Force, you can move in these directions with ease. And we clearly saw this functionality of Sideswipe and Bumblebee in the ways that they move through traffic, with the nail in the coffin being this scene alone, when the tire converts itself into Mobility Drive. But here's the kicker, the Wreckers never had this functionality, but instead they had jet boosters, and I'll cover this more when I get into Stealth Force. But to backtrack a bit, I want to touch up a bit on the Wreckers' armor, and why they have it unlike B and Swipe. An answer may come by as a shock, because it's actually not armor at all, but robot parts. And Sideswipe and B have this too if you look closely. So for example, we shall be using Bumblebee's back bumper. And what do we see? Well, robot parts of course. And it's also seen again here on B, and also on the back of Sideswipe. But now you may be wondering, why is this important? Well, the reason this is important is because, if you think about it, Race Stealth Force is an inverted version of Base Stealth Force, in the fact that for the Wreckers, most of the robot parts make armor for the outside of their vehicles, while Base Stealth Force are more inside, with the outer car parts becoming the armor. And with all that I've shown, it perfectly explains that the Wreckers use Stealth Force instead of being permanently weaponized like we all thought they were. And to seal the deal of the Wreckers, their vehicle forms are actually all from the Sprint Cup, which happened in 2009, fitting perfectly in the timeline when the Wreckers came to Earth, and why each of the Wreckers have a spoiler since each of their cars during that race had a spoiler on the back of them. And with our NASCAR friends finally out of the way, we can now move on to the main event, Stealth Force. Now Stealth Force would be Q's greatest creation, since it allows Transformers that have transformed themselves to use their weapons in robot mode in their vehicle forms. And like I said before, there are two types of Stealth Force, Base and Race. Base Stealth Force, which is what Bumblebee and Sideswipe have, which also includes the upgrade of Mobility Drive, which lets you move in a north, south, east, and west direction without having to turn. And for Bumblebee, we saw many weapons from his robot mode in his vehicle form, most notably his cannon and his missile launchers, along with getting 4 new blasters. But now you may be wondering, why does B not have these guns in robot mode? Well, the best possible answer for this would be that they reconfigure into robot parts. And this would be the best possible answer since it works with Sideswipe. And if you look at him, we all know Swipe did not have this many weapons in Dark of the Moon. The weapons that we can pick that are being cannon weapons for him are the ones that are on his hood. Since if you remember, Sideswipe used these mini missiles that he shot at sideways before cutting him in half. Now Sideswipe only had 4 exhaust ports, but only 2 of those ports shot out the missiles. And if you remember, Sideswipe shot 6 shots at sideways. And if you look at the hood, there are 6 missiles for 6 shots. But now you may be saying Trans. He also has 6 more shots on the back of him and an additional 2 in the front. Well, those would be spares that Sideswipe would store as extra ammo, which begs the question on how the heck he refills them, but that's besides the point. But if we look back at the concept art, we can see that he has guns galore, all over his vehicle mode just like in the film. And like I said before with B, these guns would most likely convert back into robot parts when Sideswipe transformed. But now let's move on to Race Stealth Force, which is what the Wreckers use. Now this Stealth Force does not have the functionality of Mobility Drive, but instead gives the Wreckers more speed, with the upgrade of jet boosters, with Leadfoots and Roadbusters being at their backs and Topspins being at his sides. And now for some weaponry, we can see that Leadfoot's minigun from the top of his car goes next to his head. The 2 other top guns go to his arms and the missile pods go on his sides. For Topspin, we can see that his 2 roof cannons go to the back of him in robot mode. His 2 other blasters would go on the undersides of his arms, but for robot mode exclusive weapons, he would have these hip mounted weapons, along with another gun on each of his arms. But his main weapon would be his claws, that he could pick up heavy objects with or rip up Decepticons to shreds. And last but not least, Roadbuster. We can see that his minigun from his vehicle mode is next to his head, similar to Leadfoot's. His 2 mini blasters, which do not appear in his robot mode oddly enough, and most notably his missile launchers that form to make shoulder cannons. But when we get into robot mode, Roadbuster has a lot more weaponry that we did not see in his vehicle mode. For example, his hip blasters, his tire blasters alongside the 2 guns that he has on his arms, and lastly, the spikes that he has on his feet that he could use to cut people up. And besides making boomsticks and grapple gloves for the Nest soldiers, that would be everything Q would do, until Barricade would take it upon himself to kill the old Autobot, ending his story for the rest of the former Transformers cinematic universe. If you enjoyed this theory in the Fixing Transformers collection, please give a like rating because it helped the channel a lot. And as always, it's been Trans Theories reminding you guys to never stop theorizing.